Get out of here! We don't take people like you! The words sliced through the night like broken glass. The driver leaned out the window, eyes narrowed. You heard me. We don't drive your kind. Get lost before I call security. For a moment, the world stood still. The hooded man froze on the curb, hand half raised, as if still clinging to the hope that this was just a cruel misunderstanding. But the sneer on the driver's face told him otherwise. Murmurs rippled through the line of waiting passengers. Some gasped, others shuffled their feet, pretending they hadn't heard. A mother pulled her child closer. A man coughed into his sleeve, anything to avoid acknowledgement. The driver slammed his fist against the door. Don't just stand there. Move along! You ain't getting in this cab! The hooded figure's arm fell slowly to his side. The rain tapped against his shoulders, each drop heavier than the last, each one echoing the sting of rejection. He wanted to answer, to push back, but the words lodged in his throat, tangled in years of silence. He had been here before. Different streets, different faces, the same wound dressed in new words. And as the driver turned away, smug in his dismissal, the crowd remained silent. Silent but watching. What none of them realized was that this night was far from ordinary. Something was about to change. The cab door slammed shut with a metallic thud, sealing the insult into the night air. The hooded man stepped back, the cold drizzle soaking into his sleeves. A whisper cut through the crowd. Why doesn't he just leave? Another voice answered, Guess he should have known better. Laughter followed, soft and sharp. Eyes darted everywhere but at him. Shoes shuffled on wet pavement. One by one, taxis rolled forward, headlights glowing, engines humming. Each driver looked his way, then away, pretending he was invisible. Doors unlocked for others. Doors locked when he moved closer. The humiliation wasn't loud. It was quieter than thunder, but heavier than stone. The kind of silence that pressed down on a man until he could barely breathe. Still, he stood. Rain dripped from the edges of his hood, pooling at his feet. He had endured worse. But endurance doesn't mean absence of pain. Somewhere in that silence, something was stirring. But not yet, not here. He didn't move. Couldn't move. His sneakers rooted to the concrete, as if the shame itself had cemented him in place. The line of passengers grew restless. One man cleared his throat. A woman checked her phone, pretending this wasn't happening just inches away. But the hooded man knew better. He could feel their eyes on him. Not the gaze of compassion, but of discomfort, judgment, and distance. The driver leaned against his wheel, smirking, confident the crowd would back his cruelty. After all, silence always favors the oppressor. The hooded man's lips parted, but no words escaped. His silence wasn't weakness, it was a mirror. Every second he stood there forced the onlookers to confront their own inaction. And that silence grew louder, heavier, until the whole street seemed to echo with what no one dared to say. But then from the corner something shifted. A faint red glow flickered against the rain. A man at the back of the line raised his phone, the tiny lens capturing everything. The glow reflected off the driver's windshield. The driver noticed, but instead of stopping, he doubled down. Are you still here? The driver shouted, voice rising. You think standing there's gonna change anything? You're wasting my time. People like you don't belong out here. Go back where you came from. Gasps broke the air. Some passengers looked shocked. Others stared harder at the ground, praying the moment would pass without their involvement. But the phone stayed steady. And another phone joined it. Then another. Soon, multiple screens glowed in the night, recording every word, every sneer, every ounce of hatred dripping from the driver's tongue. The hooded man remained motionless, but the power had begun to shift. For the first time, the driver's words weren't just insults flung into the night. They were evidence. They would live beyond this curb, beyond this rain-soaked moment. And still, the hooded figure said nothing. Not yet. The street seemed to hold its breath. Rain tapped harder, bouncing off umbrellas and jackets, but no one moved. The hooded man slowly lifted his head, water streaming down the shadow of his face. The crowd leaned in without meaning to. The driver's smirk faltered just slightly. Beneath the hood, his eyes burned with quiet defiance. His silence wasn't surrender, it was warning. The kind of silence that comes before thunder, the kind that makes even the boldest heckler take a step back. The driver's hand trembled on the steering wheel, though he tried to hide it. "What?" he barked, voice breaking at the edges. "You got something to say now?" The hooded man's chin rose, slow and steady. The storm wasn't coming. It was already here, and what the world was about to witness would leave them all speechless. Another cab. Another closed door. The words left his mouth in a whisper, swallowed by the rain. He tugged his hood tighter, not to hide, but to hold himself together. The night was long, and his body carried miles of weariness, yet his back remained straight. There was no begging in his posture, no collapse in his spirit. Every drop that hit him felt like a reminder. You don't belong, not here, not now. And still he stood. Beneath the soaked fabric was a man who had crossed oceans of doubt, deserts of rejection, and yet somehow managed to keep walking forward. Years of subtle slights, doors shut in his face, heads shaking no before he even asked. He had learned to swallow it, to carry it, to keep moving. But dignity is strange. It can look fragile on the surface, but inside, it's steel. His silence was not surrender. It was survival. And though the crowd saw only a hooded stranger, he knew his story was written in scars they couldn't see. What they didn't know, what no one there could even imagine, was just how far he had already come. He hadn't been born into comfort. His story wasn't gilded or easy. Long before the city lights, there were nights when the only thing that kept him awake was hunger, and the only thing that kept him moving was hope. He remembered his first job, scrubbing floors no one wanted to touch. "Work harder than they expect, and maybe one day they'll see you," his mother had told him. So he did. From dawn shifts to midnight grinds, he climbed. Not by shortcuts, not by favors, by sweat, persistence, and a quiet fire that no insult could extinguish. People often mistook his silence for weakness. They didn't see that silence was a shield, because when the world laughed in his face, he smiled inside, knowing tomorrow he would rise higher than they ever thought possible. Now, as he stood in the rain, drenched and dismissed, he carried that same quiet pride, the kind that says, "You can strip me of comfort, but you'll never strip me of worth." What the driver saw as nothing was, in truth, a man who had built himself from ashes. Tonight, though, he looked ordinary. No flashing lights, no entourage, no signs of success stitched onto his sleeves. He wanted it that way. Sometimes blending in was easier than standing out. Sometimes anonymity offered peace. But not tonight. The irony was sharp. This man, who carried victories that would make headlines, was treated as though he had none. To the passengers beside him, he was just another hooded stranger in the rain. They had no idea who stood in their midst. Not yet, but the night carried weight, the kind of weight you feel in your chest before lightning strikes. The air was charged, heavy with something no one could name. He shifted his feet, lifted his head, and in that quiet moment, the storm began to stir. What came next would shake everyone awake. "Taxi!" His voice cut through the rain, firm but restrained. A cab slowed, hope flickered, then sped away, tires hissing as it splashed through puddles. Another one followed, headlights briefly sweeping across his face before turning deliberately toward someone else further down the curb. He raised his arm higher, palm open, as if to say, "I'm here. I'm human. I need a ride too." But driver after driver acted as if he were invisible. A young couple, barely dry under their shared umbrella, stepped into the street. Instantly, a taxi screeched to a halt in front of them. The door swung open. Smiles. No hesitation. The man lowered his hand slowly, watching. His chest tightened, not from the rain's chill, but from the familiar sting of exclusion. He wasn't new to this, being overlooked, passed over, disregarded. It had trailed him all his life like a shadow. One thought echoed, "They see me." They just choose not to. The city around him buzzed with laughter, chatter, movement. For everyone else, the night carried on. For him, the night stalled in a loop of raised hands and silent rejection. But then, one driver did stop. The man's hope rose until the window slid down. The driver leaned out, smirking, voice dripping with venom. "Are you sure you can afford this ride?" The words sliced deeper than any rejection. They weren't curious. They weren't playful. They were meant to wound. The man stood tall, though every muscle inside screamed. "I said I need a taxi," he replied, steady, refusing to match the poison. The driver let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Buddy, this ain't charity. Try the bus stop down the street. Cheaper, more your style." The insult lingered in the air, heavy, humiliating. A couple of passengers nearby chuckled, not because it was funny, but because discomfort often hides behind nervous laughter. The man's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. His silence wasn't weakness, it was a shield. Years of discrimination had taught him this. Some battles are fought not with words, but with restraint. Still, silence hurts too, the driver muttered. "Didn't think so," then revved the engine and pulled off, leaving exhaust in his wake. The man stayed where he was, drenched, ignored but unbroken. He wasn't imagining it. The drivers gathered down the line were watching him. Their voices were low, their eyes flicking his way with thinly veiled disdain. "Not worth the trouble," one murmured. "They're always like that," another replied. "Waste of time." The man caught every word without needing to strain. Racism doesn't always scream. It often whispers, subtle enough for deniability, sharp enough to pierce. He glanced at them, not pleading, not begging, just letting them know he heard. They turned away quickly as if exposure burned, but the damage was already done. Each dismissive glance stacked on the last, building a wall of rejection that towered higher by the second, and yet he remained rooted to the curb. He had waded through worse storms than this. He would not let whispers decide his worth. Minutes dragged. Rain pooled at his feet, soaking through shoes already worn thin from the grind of life. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. His silence was not consent, it was armor. Still, the weight of injustice pressed on him. Every ignored wave was a reminder that dignity in this world often came with conditions. But he refused to bow. His posture, though weary, carried a quiet defiance. He was used to discrimination's sting, but never numb. That wound never dulled. It only cut deeper each time. He stood, waiting, watching, enduring. Only one cab remained at the end of the stand. For the first time, a bystander frowned, noticing the injustice unfolding. Their eyes followed the hooded man as he straightened his back and stepped forward. This was it, the last chance, the final test. And as he reached for the handle, the air itself seemed to pause, bracing for what would come next. "Get away from my cab!" The driver barked, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. "I don't drive your kind. You hear me? Move before I call security!" The words hit harder than the rain soaking through the man's hood. He stood frozen, hand still on the taxi door handle, while the driver's face twisted with open disgust. "Did you not hear me?" The driver shouted again, louder this time so everyone in line could hear. "You don't belong here." "Not in my car." "Not in my city." A murmur rippled through the bystanders. Some gasped, others shifted uncomfortably, but no one stepped forward. The man let go of the door handle slowly, as though it were burning him. He straightened, shoulders squared, saying nothing. His silence enraged the driver even more. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? You think standing there makes you equal?" The driver sneered. "You're nothing. Less than nothing. Now back off before I drag you out myself." The man's eyes lifted just enough for the driver to see them. Calm, steady, refusing to break. That look should have ended it, but instead, it fueled the fire. The driver slammed his palm against the steering wheel, horn blaring. "Security!" He yelled toward the station entrance. "Come get this trash off my line!" The night cracked open with those words, and for the man, humiliation wasn't whispered anymore. It was shouted for all to hear. But this was only the beginning. The crowd stiffened. Phones were raised. Red recording dots blinked in the darkness. A few faces showed shock, but most turned away, pretending not to notice. A businessman adjusted his tie and stared down at his shoes. A college kid pretended to scroll through his phone. A group of friends whispered, their laughter strained but persistent, an awkward attempt to drown out reality. The man stood in the rain, feeling every eye that wouldn't meet his. Silence pressed in heavier than the downpour. One passenger muttered, "That's not right." But the words fell into the void, swallowed by indifference. Nobody answered. Nobody moved. The driver leaned out again, emboldened by the stillness. "See? Nobody's going to help you. Everyone knows the truth. You don't belong here. They're all just too polite to say it." The man's chest rose and fell, steady but heavy. He could feel the truth in the driver's cruelty. Silence from the crowd wasn't neutral. It was complicity. He looked around at the faces ducking away, the eyes hiding behind screens. For a brief moment, he wondered which cut deeper, the slur thrown at him or the world's decision to look the other way. And then, as if to drive the wound deeper, a mother pulled her child closer. "Don't look," the mother whispered urgently, tugging her daughter against her side. "Stay close to me." The little girl's wide eyes peeked from behind her arm, innocent and uncomprehending. "Why, Mama? What did he do?" The mother hushed her, voice trembling. Some people are dangerous. Just stay away." The man heard every word. He wasn't meant to, but he did. And each syllable felt heavier than the rain soaking through his clothes. He hadn't spoken a single threat, hadn't raised his hand. His only crime was existing in the wrong skin, at the wrong time, in front of the wrong people. The child's eyes lingered on him, confused, almost curious. She didn't see a monster. She saw a man standing in the storm. But her mother's grip pulled her tighter, dragging her further away, teaching fear where none belonged. The man lowered his gaze. Not because of shame, but because innocence had been poisoned in front of him. That wound cut deeper than any insult hurled from the driver's seat. He breathed slowly, holding it in, refusing to let the pain spill out. Because if he broke now, he knew. This crowd would believe it justified every lie told about him. But even in that suffocating silence, one voice finally rose. "Enough!" The shout came from a man near the back of the line. His voice trembled, but it carried. "He's just trying to get home." "Let him ride!" Heads turned. The driver's eyes narrowed. "Mind your business," he snapped. "Unless you want to walk too." The bystander didn't flinch. "This isn't right." "Everyone here knows it." His tone wavered, searching for allies, but none came. The crowd stayed frozen, their silence louder than any protest. The driver laughed bitterly. "You don't get it, do you? Guys like him, they bring trouble. I'm protecting my car, my livelihood. You want me to risk that? For him?" The bystander clenched his fists. "He's a paying passenger, same as anyone else." The driver spat the word back at him. "Not the same. Never the same." The tension snapped tight. For a moment, it seemed like someone else might join in. A few faces softened, sympathy flickering, but the weight of fear crushed it back down. And the hooded man? He stood in silence, saying nothing. Raindrops slid from his hood, dripping in slow rivulets down his face. His silence filled the air, sharper than any argument, heavier than any protest. Every insult hung unanswered. Every slur floated back into the night, finding no fuel to burn further. The driver sneered, frustrated by the lack of reaction. "Look at him, too scared to even speak. That's all he is, all he'll ever be." But the man's stillness was not fear. It was power. An unshakable refusal to degrade himself by shouting back at hate. The longer he stood, the more unbearable the silence became. The crowd shifted nervously. Even the driver's laughter thinned, uneasy. Something was building. Everyone could feel it. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside him, and then, slowly, his hand reached for his hood. With deliberate calm, he pushed the hood from his head. The rain lit his features, sharp and unmistakable. Gasps erupted in unison. Phones dropped. Eyes widened, and in that instant the crowd realized who they had just denied. But the story was far from over. "Hold up. Is that—" "No way!" A young voice cracked through the stunned silence, followed by another gasp, louder this time. That's Snoop Dogg. The name cut the air like lightning. Heads spun, eyes widened, and disbelief rippled through the crowd. Whispers turned into waves of recognition. Some mouths dropped open. Others lifted phones higher, hands shaking, desperate not to miss a single second. The driver froze. His chest, puffed a moment ago, full of hate and power, now deflated in a heartbeat. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Sweat clung to his brow. Snoop said nothing. He just stood there, hood now lowered, rain dripping from the edges, his stare heavy enough to silence even the most cynical eyes. "Man, that driver just disrespected Snoop Dogg," someone whispered near the front. The words carried, echoing like a charge through the crowd. Suddenly, the insult wasn't just against a man, it was against an icon, and everyone knew it. Phones flashed. People shouted over one another. The driver's face twisted, fighting to keep control, but the tide was shifting faster than he could grasp. Snoop's silence burned hotter than any insult. The crowd leaned forward, waiting for him to speak, waiting for the hammer to fall, and when it finally did, nothing could prepare the driver for the weight of those words. "Tell me something." Snoop's voice came low, smooth, almost casual, yet each syllable cut like a blade. "You sure about that ride, nephew?" The crowd roared, not in laughter, but in awe. The street seemed to shake under the echo of his voice. People pressed closer, chanting his name, their energy feeding on his calm fire. The driver's jaw trembled. I didn't know it was you," he stammered, voice cracking. I wasn't what?" Snoop interrupted, leaning in just enough to let the silence choke him. "Wasn't gonna stop? Or wasn't gonna let me in 'cause you thought you could treat me like dirt?" Gasps cut through the air. Even those who had looked away before couldn't pretend anymore. The mask of casual prejudice had been ripped clean off, and the driver stood exposed. "No disrespect, sir. I was just—" Snoop raised a hand, and the man's excuses died mid-sentence. "Don't sir me now. You made your choice. Now you gotta stand in it." The crowd erupted, voices pounding the air. Every phone caught every word, each recording another nail sealing the driver's fate. And still, Snoop hadn't raised his voice once. The driver's bravado crumbled like wet paper. "Look, I didn't mean nothing by it," he pleaded, eyes darting to the crowd, to the dozens of cameras watching him drown. But his voice betrayed him, shaky, desperate, each word weaker than the last. "I was just following the line. Just doing my job." "Your job?" someone shouted back. "Your job's discrimination." The driver's cheeks burned. He tugged at his collar as if trying to loosen the noose of his own words. But there was no escape. Each excuse only made the crowd lean in further, hungry for truth, for justice. Snoop stood unmoved, letting the silence swallow the driver's stutters. Every second stretched, every heartbeat louder than the last, and then the whispers began again. Only this time they weren't hushed. "Let him ride," one voice demanded. "Yeah, let him in!" Another joined. The murmurs swelled, spreading like fire in dry grass. Soon the street shook with chants, fists raised, phones flashing. "Let him ride! Let him ride!" The driver flinched at every word, shrinking smaller with each chant. His authority, the arrogance that had dripped from him only minutes ago, was gone, torn away by the very voices he once counted on to stay silent. This wasn't his street anymore. It was Snoop's, and the driver knew it. "This ain't just about me," Snoop's voice rang out, steady but sharp enough to pierce the noise. The chants fell quiet as every head turned toward him. He didn't raise his tone, but the weight behind each word demanded attention. "They thought they could play me small. But look around. How many times has it happened to somebody without a name? Without a camera? Without a crowd to back him up?" His eyes scanned the people, catching them one by one. Murmurs rippled, uneasy, like truth cutting too close. Snoop shook his head slowly. "This ain't one man's fight. This is about the disrespect that gets passed off as normal. About the folks who keep their mouths shut, thinking it ain't their problem." His words hung in the rain, heavier than thunder. "Racism hides in plain sight. You ignore it today, it grows tomorrow. So don't clap for me. Stand up for the ones nobody sees." The crowd erupted, voices clashing between guilt and fire, but no one could deny the sting of truth. Snoop had turned humiliation into a mirror, and now everyone had to face their reflection. And then, from the edge of the crowd, the voice that had spoken once before rose again. "That man's right!" the bystander shouted, stepping forward, his courage louder now. "If it can happen to him, it can happen to any of us." "Enough is enough!" The silence cracked. Another voice joined. Then another. Soon the crowd wasn't whispering. It was answering, alive with defiance. "Enough! Respect for everyone." "No more silence!" The words rolled together, building like a storm. The same strangers who had once looked away now stood shoulder to shoulder, their unity drowning out the fear that had kept them quiet. The driver shifted uneasily, realizing the ground had shifted beneath him. He wasn't facing one man anymore. He was facing many, and in the swell of their voices, footsteps approached with authority. A sharp tone cut through the chaos. "Step aside. The company's been notified." A supervisor appeared, flanked by another driver, eyes stern and unflinching. "Sir, you're done for the night," the supervisor declared, his tone final. "Hand over your keys. You're suspended. Effective immediately," the driver sputtered. "You don't understand, it was—" "No excuses," the supervisor cut in coldly. "We don't tolerate discrimination, not here. Not now." The keys clattered into his palm, and with them, the driver's last shred of authority. The crowd cheered, phones capturing the fall of a man who thought silence would protect him. But silence had finally turned on him. The cheering shook the curb as Snoop straightened, rain sliding down his shoulders. He raised a hand and the crowd quieted, hanging on his final words. "Respect ain't optional," he said firmly. "It's the bare minimum. Remember that." Applause roared. Chants reignited, and the moment burned itself into memory, more than a story, more than a headline, because long after the rain stopped, those words would remain. "Have you ever been denied?" The words cut straight through, not as a story, but as a challenge. Maybe it was a store clerk who followed you around like a thief. Maybe a job interview where you knew the seat was never really yours. Maybe a simple ride, refused because of the color of your skin. Discrimination wears many faces, but it always leaves the same scar, humiliation wrapped in silence. Think about it. Has injustice ever stared you down, daring you to speak while the world looked away? And if it did, how did you respond? Now picture yourself back at that taxi stand. The rain dripped, the crowd watching, the insult still hanging in the air. Would you cross your arms and say, "Not my business"? Or would you take one step forward, risk the awkward silence, and speak truth in the face of hate? It's easy to watch from a distance. Harder when it's your moment, your voice, your choice. But in that split second, the whole story can change. Here's the truth. Silence helps the oppressor. Your voice helps the victim. No middle ground. Every moment of discrimination asks the same question. Will you be part of the problem or part of the resistance? Drop your answer in the comments. Share this story if you believe respect is non-negotiable. Because one voice can spark many, and tonight, that voice could be yours. So tell me, silence or voice? Which one are you?